So I'm here with Amanda, who works on our admissions team. Yeah, let's get started. So as you're kind of watching, we encourage you to tweet at us at Flatiron School at Flombaum. Your favorite quotes. I tend to say some ridiculous things. And then at the end of the webinar, we're going to give you guys a special offer for the school. So as I was saying, I'm Avi. I'm one of the founders of the school. I've been programmed since I was like 11. I fly planes. I taught Carly Kloss and Rebecca Minkoff how to program. I bring software pack at my last startup called Designer Pages, and I give fun talks. So yeah, and I've been here for just over 5 years. We actually just had our 5-year anniversary. So I don't know how much you guys know about Flatiron School, but we basically teach people how to code and get them jobs. Today we're going to talk about maybe a topic in the developer community and the bootcamp community, which is Ruby versus JavaScript, and why we think you should learn both those languages. Tell you a little bit about the pros and cons of just learning JavaScript, and then talk a little bit about why we think that really Ruby and JavaScript lend to the most successful career that we've seen our alumni have. So yeah, let's get started. So at Flatiron School, we basically everything that you need to know to build a web application. And a web application is something like Airbnb or Twitter or Facebook, things like that. They have a lot of data, the page and the contents are always changing, and the only things that you need to know in order to build that are HTML, CSS, a back-end language like Ruby, a database language like SQL, generally a web framework like Ruby on Rails, JavaScript for front-end, jQuery to kind of understand how to manipulate the DOM, make it interactive, React, which is a front-end framework for really building complex interfaces, and so is Ember. So we teach a lot of different kind of techniques for becoming what is known as a full-stack web developer. That's what we want. That's what we really focus on. School is making people as flexible and as comprehensive full-stack developers as we can. But really, throughout the program, what we really want to focus on is how to program, is learning how to program, and really learning how to learn. Languages you get a lot about in terms of Ruby's a little different from JavaScript, but really programming is kind of universal. And we think of it as the science of operations. There's a famous programmer, or a very early programmer named Lovelace, who really figured out what the future of programming would be. And she called it the science of operations, this idea of giving infallible, detailed instructions to a machine. Because the machines are pretty stupid, they don't know anything, and you have to teach them everything. And the way you kind of do that is by really understanding how the big problem you're trying to solve can be broken into small parts that you can then put back together. So understanding how to break problems down and integrate different components or data into your program is basically what we think modern programming is all about. It requires you to constantly iterate and change things and stay agile and adapt your code and your environment to the changing requirements of your software, of your team, and things like that. And ultimately, the point of being a developer is really to create software that creates meaning for people, that gives them new kinds of value in their life. So what we really want to teach you beyond Ruby and JavaScript is this art and this craft of understanding what the kind of universal things in programming are, how to break things down, how to integrate different components you've built or other people have built, how to constantly be iterating and building on top of each other, and ultimately create value. So let's talk a little bit about Ruby. I have learned, I don't know how many programming languages, but around like almost 11 years ago, I was thinking about moving away from C# and ASP.NET, which was kind of like the Microsoft stack, into something more open source friendly. So I was choosing between Python and Ruby, and I really like white space, so I didn't go with Python. I started learning Ruby, and it's a pretty awesome language. It's definitely my favorite language I've ever learned. It is not the only language I use or teach, but it is the one I love. And Ruby was invented in probably like 1993, 1994 by a Japanese programmer named Yukihiro Matsumoto. Everyone just calls him Mats. Mats is a super friendly, super nice guy, to the point where the Ruby community adopted a saying called the Min Swan, which is Mats is nice, so we are nice. Ruby was invented to make you happy, and a lot about the programming language is about kind of creating pleasure and joy from programming. As far as I know, and actually there was just a discussion on Twitter about this, Ruby is the only programming language in the world whose sole goal is to make you, the programmer, happy. Programming languages are invented for a ton of reasons. They're ubiquitous, they're cross-platform, they compile really quickly, they deal with asynchronous paradigms really well. Ruby was invented to make you happy. And I think that as a beginner learning how to code, because learning how to code is hard, thinking about the language that is optimized for your pleasure, for your happiness, might be a good place to start. And then Ruby on Rails, a web framework invented in around 2004 by a Danish programmer named David Heinemeier Hansen, or DHH. It was kind of one of the first, if not the first, really high-efficiency web frameworks that allowed you to build really amazing web applications really quickly. So Shopify, New Relic, Twilio, Twitter, Groupon, Square, Basecamp, just so many startups were really built because of Ruby on Rails. And Ruby on Rails is still, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, the best framework to choose for a simple software as a service startup, which are things like Basecamp and Twilio, where people are basically buying a subscription to a web application. It is a tremendously popular web framework. There's a huge community behind it, so you have thousands of people making plugins and gems and making sure the code is good quality and faster. It is a great, great active community of programmers that are also tend to be pretty friendly and knowledgeable. So that's a little about Ruby. And there's a lot of myths about Ruby. So one, people think Ruby is outdated. And that's kind of an interesting thing because I just don't know what that means. On one level, Ruby is both a really young language, and that was invented in 1993, 94, and then also it might be like a really old language depending on how you think about time. But it is a tremendously still a very modern language. People are still pushing the envelope of what it can do. We are seeing new and better Ruby versions every year. Right now we're at Ruby 2.4, but there's a big project going on for Ruby 3.0, which is going to make it way faster. So it's not outdated. Rails 5.1 just came out. There's still a lot of innovations happening through the Ruby and the Ruby on Rails community. People say there are no Ruby jobs. I don't know, we hire Ruby developers every day here, so I just don't know what they're talking about. I know all my friends' companies and basically still use Ruby for a lot of different tasks. I mean, Ruby is interesting because things like Chef and Puppet, a lot of developer operations, that's built in Ruby. So beyond just building web applications, there's a lot of other kind of programming tooling that goes into Ruby, and it's just a really great general-purpose programming language. There's a huge ecosystem of Ruby jobs. People think Ruby is really hard to learn, and I think that that's conflated with how you have to set up an environment, and Ruby doesn't really work natively in a browser, so you can't just pop up in a web browser console, but you have to have a terminal and a compiler and things like that. But ultimately, we think Ruby is a great language to learn because of how multi-paradigmed it is in its approach to object orientation. So there's a clear progression to what you need to learn. We don't necessarily feel that it's hard. We think actually it's a great programming language to learn at first. We just think that learning any language at first is hard. And then that Ruby is basically not enterprise or not web scale, that you only build it for small projects, that it's a toy. And that's just simply not true. Shopify is a publicly traded project. GitHub, I mean, the thing we all use for source control, that is a Ruby code base. There are massive projects that have spanned 10 years or more that are using Ruby on Rails, from Basecamp to GitHub to Shopify to Twilio, Twitter even. There are huge, huge websites that Ruby and Ruby on Rails are used for. So while it is great for small projects, it also is great for the Learn code base, which is how we teach at Flatiron School, is a Ruby on Rails project. I think it's 84,000 lines of code. It works. So don't believe everything you read on Reddit or Hacker News about these languages. So let's talk about JavaScript. So JavaScript was basically invented by a programmer at then Mozilla/Netscape, Brendan Eich, in 1995. He invented it in 10 days to compete with a Microsoft scripting language that they were packaging with Internet Explorer. And basically, JavaScript became the language that we use to manipulate web pages once they're loaded. So that you're building your web page in HTML and CSS, and then you want to kind of change some text or make a pop-up and things like that. JavaScript was invented as a simple scripting language in order to give a developer an ability to manipulate what we call the document object model, or the DOM, after a web page is loaded. So the first JavaScript compiler engine was built directly into the browser, and then kind of people started iterating on it. So like in the, late 90s, early 2000s, I remember that the way you kind of used to make a web page interactive was through a language called Macromedia Flash. And you'd have these kind of Flash macros that stood out from the page, and they'd be able to have dynamic content. But then slowly we started using JavaScript for that. And then in around 2004 or 2003, a JavaScript library called jQuery came out, which basically, because JavaScript had a really weird API and how to use it was kind of like not super spec'd out, and every browser is implementing different versions of JavaScript. So this developer named John Resig kind of formalized the document object API that he believed in and invented something called jQuery, which was a really, really, really massively popular JavaScript framework that I think is used on like 51% of the top 100 websites on the planet. And what it really did was it standardized the way in which we interact with the DOM throughout the cross browsers. And then around 2000, what was it, probably 2006 or something, 2007, this guy named Jesse James Garrett at a consulting shop called Adaptive Path figured out a way that you could use JavaScript to load data asynchronously so that you could start really making the web pages dynamic. Like an infinite scroll or an autocomplete would basically allow you to use JavaScript to request data from the back end and then integrate it into your front end, which added a lot of possibility. Basically, everyone started building all of their interfaces in JavaScript, and it was awesome. So JavaScript becomes a dominant front-end language. And then in around like 2008, 2009 maybe, Google basically invents something called the Rhino engine, or the V8 engine, which is the first virtual machine or compiler for JavaScript that ran outside of the browser, so that you could download this V8 engine, this V8 compiler, and run JavaScript code outside of a web browser, which basically meant you could start using JavaScript for back-end languages. And we're going to talk a little about what the front end and the back end is. But the front end is the interface, what the user is seeing. It's kind of the thing most in front of them, and the back end is what's happening behind the scenes. So like, clicking load more posts is a front end. The thing that actually goes to the database and pulls out the posts to load is the back end. So JavaScript suddenly could work for back end tasks. Basically a year after the V8 engine is released, this guy, Ryan Don, makes something called the Node, which is basically a framework for building web applications through JavaScript. And now people start building backends that used to be powered by Python or Ruby or Java. They start building them in JavaScript, and that kind of is how JavaScript has been evolving. That we're seeing it being used not just inside browsers or in or for front ends, but really for backends also. So there are a few kind of, in any kind of pro and con list, you're basically, it's all value sentiments. In my opinion, there are some pros of learning only JavaScript. One, JavaScript generally out of the box is slightly faster than object-oriented languages like Python or Java. Well, not Java, but Python or Ruby for sure. In theory, if you only learn JavaScript, you only need to learn one language for both your front end, like your interfaces, and your back end. JavaScript has gained popularity very quickly in that basically every web developer already knew JavaScript from the front-end days, and now that we can also use it in the back-end through languages like Node and Express, it gained a lot of popularity. Then you had this kind of proliferation of front-end frameworks like React and Angular that really created these really intricate, immersive interfaces and really interactive interfaces. And then it is pretty ubiquitous, and by ubiquitous I mean that it works almost everywhere. There are JavaScript packages for Arduinos, for drones, for browsers, for backends. So there are a lot of good reasons to just know JavaScript. But there are a lot of bad reasons to just learn JavaScript. For one, JavaScript doesn't have something called a standard library. And a standard library is like, there are certain things that you always want to do in a programming language. So for instance, like reading a CSV. You want to parse a CSV, a comma-separated value sheet, a spreadsheet. In Ruby, that component is part of a standard library. So a standard library is basically all of the basic tools you're going to need already written for you in that language. And learning how to use a standard library is super important, because if you don't know how to use a standard library, you're going to end up rebuilding things that already exist. JavaScript has no standard library. So you're not going to learn how to kind of read a language's documentation and find those kind of things. There are not a lot of strong patterns in JavaScript. You can use JavaScript on a prototypical inheritance or a prototypical object orientation or functional or scripted or interpreted. There's like 100 different ways to use JavaScript. In fact, there's like 10 different versions of JavaScript that are currently supported, from like ECMA 5 to ECMA 2016 to 2017. So there's just not a lot of strong patterns. And I think that when you're first starting to learn how to program, understanding what a pattern is and what a design pattern is and how to use it, how to read that, how to kind of take your problem and understand the solution that someone has already made for solving those kinds of problems is really important. And the fact that JavaScript is just so pattern agnostic, it doesn't have any strong patterns both in the language and in the frameworks we use, I think that's a huge con in terms of how you think about programming. Only knowing one language is going to limit your career opportunities. It's going to be hard to convince employers that you're capable of learning other languages when you only have ever learned one. You're just not going to be a Swiss Army knife. You're going to basically have a very specific kind of tooling that you know how to use to solve a specific kind of problem, but it's going to be hard for you to kind of expand your career beyond that language and beyond that tooling. As I said before, there are so many different versions of JavaScript that even discussing learning JavaScript is kind of ambiguous to me. I just don't know what you're talking about. And the most modern versions of JavaScript, like TypeScript or ECMA 2017, aren't fully supported by browsers. So there's kind of, again, as a beginner, when you're trying to really focus on something simple and contained, the fact that there's like 100 different versions of JavaScript, I think, adds a lot of complexity to your learning journey. And then the other thing about JavaScript is, because of all the ways it's being used now that it wasn't necessarily designed to be used in, you have to learn a lot of tooling. In Ruby, you have to learn about Ruby gems and bundler. In JavaScript, you're going to have to learn about like gulp and bower and yarn and npm, and there's so many kind of tools that you need to learn in order to make JavaScript compatible and functional for you. And again, as a beginner, I think what you should be trying to focus on is like understanding the abstractions of programming, the generalities, and you're going to spend a lot of time learning a lot of really specific things that are only applicable to the JavaScript community, ecosystem, and language. And that's, again, I think just a con. So we like to teach Ruby and JavaScript at Flatiron School because, I guess on one level, I don't see why you can't do both. If you learn how to program your first language in a manner that is generic enough that allows you to basically take what you've learned in one language and move it to a second language, that doesn't add a lot of time to your learning. So I think a lot of these schools that are telling you just learn JavaScript are really introducing a false dichotomy. You don't have to make that choice. You can very easily, in the same amount of time, learn as proficiently 2 languages as you did 1 if it's taught correctly. So that's what we try to do at Flatiron School. And we do that to make you more versatile so that you can think differently about problems, that you understand different approaches and patterns in solving things, that you know what the difference between an object-oriented language and a functional language are, between synchronous code and asynchronous code. When you only learn JavaScript or when you only learn Ruby, you're learning a single paradigm, a single perspective on every problem. And when, the cliche is, if all you have is a hammer, everything is going to look like a nail. If all you have is JavaScript, you're going to only try to solve problems through one framework or through one mindset, and that's going to generally make it's going to make programming a painful experience. Object orientation, which is a very pure concept in Ruby, is crucial to programming. Object orientation, which was invented in the 70s in some place called XPark by a guy named Alan Kay and Adele Goldberg, it's one of the most important paradigms in programming. And JavaScript is simply not an object-oriented language. It lets you fake it, but it's not pure object orientation. And I think that understanding object orientation as an early programmer is super important. It took me years to really learn it, and I wasted a lot of time programming in really bad, painful patterns because I didn't understand OO. And then understanding how to use front-end frameworks like React and Ember and Angular, understanding jQuery, that's also really important. And if you only learn Ruby, you're not going to really understand how to interact with the DOM. So again, I think that you want to be a very good back-end programmer and front-end programmer, and that means learning 2 languages. Because if you only learn JavaScript for the back-end, your kind of mastery or understanding of back-end is very much incomplete. Learning how to learn is the most important skill in programming, because it's always evolving. And there's always new languages and new frameworks and new patterns and new techniques. And throughout our experience teaching you, we want to give you kind of that meta skill, that metacognition of knowing how to learn new things, of how to Google effectively, how to debug. And the more languages you're exposed to at first, the more your mind is willing to accept different kinds of paradigms. You're not going to be like stuck into one pattern for a really long time. And then finally, while JavaScript might get you a first job, it's not going to get you a career. I don't know any prolific developers who only work in JavaScript. And we don't think about your job at Flatiron School. We really try to think about your career. And we just think that Ruby and JavaScript together prepare you not just for your first job, but for a really long and kind of prolific career. We have alumni that are core contributors to Ember that speak at conferences about Ruby. So I think the reason why our alumni do so well is really because of their versatility, because they're able to learn really quickly. They understand both paradigms of functional and object-oriented programming really well, and that's what lends them to growing as developers really quickly after their first job. So that's it. I mean, Ruby and JavaScript really make you a Swiss Army knife. They're not discrete tools where, like, I use Ruby for this and JavaScript for that, but really understanding both those languages and how they come together from back end to front end, what they're good for. When you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole using JavaScript for the wrong problem, or Ruby, or vice versa. When you really learn both those languages proficiently, you're going to be able to tackle any problem, and you're going to have a very diverse set of tools to solve problems and build cool applications. So yeah, that's kind of what we think. On average, full stack developers make more money. A lot of people that just learn JavaScript end up becoming front-end developers, which basically means they're just working on the interfaces, and the mid-level salary for a front-end developer that's not building in back-ends in like Ruby or Node or Python is significantly less than a full stack developer. And in order to be a full stack developer, you need to know more than just JavaScript, because the JavaScript backends like Node are just less popular than other backends, and they're written in way different paradigms. So again, we just really think that that idea of what object orientation is and how crucial it is to a long-term programming career is one of the reasons why we want to teach Ruby and continue to teach Ruby, despite this idea that, like, oh, you only need to learn JavaScript. I mean, in the history of computing, there's literally never been just one language. Understanding that languages aren't what's important, that like how you solve problems is what's important, is I think a great thing for a beginner programmer to learn. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in that myopic idea of all programming is JavaScript and it all works that way, when that's simply not true. And then they're just, all the big companies wouldn't work with just JavaScript and Ruby. If those companies like Facebook and Microsoft and Airbnb and Netflix, if they're not choosing just one language, and they use a variety of languages from Go to Elixir, Ruby, JavaScript, Python, Java, .NET, C#, they use so many different languages because each language is kind of a very specific tool that is the perfect tool for the right problem. If they're not making a choice between one language, why should you as a student? You want to learn a lot of languages, and you want to know how to learn languages and how to really fall in love with them and enjoy them and embrace them and identify when a language is the right tool for a job. Yeah, the market kind of, again, because JavaScript works both on the front end and the back end, you kind of see a lot more JavaScript jobs, but a lot of those are just front end jobs. And again, front end jobs are going to really pigeonhole your career and your salary. So learning both of them makes you way more hireable. You're going to learn a pure object-oriented language, which again is something I think everyone agrees is super important. JavaScript is a lot of hype. Like a year and a half ago, we had to rewrite all of our curriculum because the world decided to move from Angular to React. Angular is a front-end framework by Google that was super popular, and we were teaching Angular because that's what everyone said you needed to know in order to get a job. And then everyone at once was like, no, we're going to use React. And React is by Facebook, so everyone moved to React. But like, if you just learn one front-end framework, you just will learn one back-end language in JavaScript, just realize that if that's all you know and that falls out of hype, you're kind of screwed. And especially if you don't have the kind of tool set to learn new languages and new technologies quickly because you only learn one, that's a problem. And then again, there's just so many publicly traded companies that are built with Ruby, which means that there's always going to be job opportunities, and they're going to only continue to grow. And again, you see Ruby being used more and more for like DevOps and infrastructure kind of code also. And then again, I mean, we really think that like the most important thing to focus on as a beginner is really learning how to learn, getting a really good approach to how you discover languages, how you solve problems, and things like that. And yeah, learning to program is hard, but it's not impossible. It's just hard. And I think the best thing you could do is really learn to kind of love code and falling in love with it, in the sense that as you learn how to program, things are going to be broken, it's going to be really difficult, and you're going to be really frustrated. But the more that you learn to see those as challenges and that open up your mind as opposed to close them, I think that's going to really be a key to success. My best advice for you if you're trying to learn how to code right now is just start. Pick a language. If it's JavaScript, start there. If it's Ruby, start there. But pick one language, don't switch, and just start actually writing code. We've got a lot of free content on learn.co, which is our online platform, in both Ruby and JavaScript, and just start actually writing code. It's really easy to get swept up in the hype of like, well, this is the best language to learn, and what if I'm learning right now is already out of date and it's not going to make me hireable. I think the earlier you are in the career, the less that those decisions really matter. The important thing is you start making progress. And I've seen beginners, come to me and be like, hey, I heard that everyone learns React and that React has the most jobs. I want to get a job as quickly as possible, so how do I learn just React? The problem is that in order to learn React, you need to know JavaScript really, really, really well. So don't get caught up on like React or JavaScript or Node or Ruby. Again, just really learn one of them and then start making progress. And just front-end frameworks like React and Angular are not where you get started. Those are tremendously complex. You want to learn a programming language like Ruby or JavaScript or Python, and not a framework like Ruby on Rails or Node or Express or React. And then learn to use real tools. We think Code Academy is great to get started. If you've never programmed at all ever before, maybe start there. But the way we teach on learn.co is actually through a real tool set, through GitHub and developer environment, a terminal, Bash, a text editor, test-driven development. We want you reading code, reading error messages, understanding what TDD means, understanding how to set up an environment and use a programming environment. We think that how you work is as important as what you know. So on Learn.co, our online platform, you're going to learn about real tooling and kind of a real developer workflow that integrates with GitHub and Slack and Atom, the GitHub text editor, and a terminal and things like that. Yeah, and programming is really awesome. It is like easily my favorite thing in the whole wide world. I don't know how long I kind of started learning when I was like 11, so it's been basically my entire life, and we really love it. And I think that one thing we really do at Flatiron School that we don't get to talk a lot about is that more than Ruby and JavaScript, we really want you, the student, to learn and love code. We want you to feel kind of as passionately and profoundly about programming as we do, because we know that when it does get hard, and I promise you in everyone's journey at some point, in mine and every instructor here and all of our journeys, at some point learning to code becomes very, very hard. And what gets you through those humps aren't the fact that you're brilliant or that you got a lot of motivation. It's that you really love what you're doing and you care about it and it becomes a part of you. So our Flatiron School programs are online. We have a web developer program that is the same exact curriculum as our in-person boot camp. In New York City, we have an amazing campus with awesome instructors that is our software engineering immersive, so it's 15 weeks long. And by the way, online we have amazing instructors too. They're great. And then we also have a community-powered boot camp, which is basically access to our curriculum and hundreds of students that are also trying to learn together. And we know it's a pretty social platform, from study groups to chat to friends. And then we have these free online courses like Bootcamp Prep, which is the best way to get started knowing if you actually like programming and preparing for a boot camp, both the interview and even if you've been admitted. Just the more you know going into a boot camp, the better it's going to be. So get started at flatironschool.com. And yeah, I'm super happy to take any questions. If there's a question we can't answer, you can always reach out to me. I'm avi@flatironschool.com or admissions@flatironschool.com. They're an amazing team. And this month we have our Commit to Code Scholarship, which is a $1,500 merit scholarship to our online program. We're going to award those scholarships to applicants that demonstrate progress online, that are self-motivated and passionate. And we'll be just check your email for more information after that, after the webinar. So with that, I'm super happy to answer questions. I have no idea how long that was.
Yeah,
felt like a long
we
time.
got time. We got a ton of time.
Great.
So one question that we're getting is from a few different people is, so we're saying it's best to have 2 languages in your arsenal from the outset. Should people try to learn 2 languages at once? Should they pick one first and then plan to learn the other one second?
Yep. Yeah, I think that pick one first and plan to learn the second on the onset. So whether if you start with JavaScript, you want to learn JavaScript, understand how it manipulates HTML and CSS, how you use jQuery, maybe then a front-end framework like React. But I would actually skip React and not get into the complexity of front-end frameworks like React and Angular. I would want to learn JavaScript in like a web way, in the sense that I want to learn really jQuery and JavaScript, how to like, imagine trying to build like tic-tac-toe in the browser. I think that'd be the amount of JavaScript you want to learn. Then I'd move to Ruby or a back-end language, and then learn the back-end language, how to supply data. So for instance, how to like save the fact that you won a game of tic-tac-toe and see like how many games you've won versus how many games your friend won, or like logging and having accounts, like a back-end kind of thing. And then learn React and kind of integrate them both, with like the ultimate goal, and where our students end their journey at Flatiron School is they build a Ruby on Rails backend with a React front end. And I think once you can do that, you're really a pretty competent full stack web developer. But I would start with one language, learn it to a point of proficiency. So if it's JavaScript, that does not mean React. It might mean like a simple Express app or a simple Node app, or even better yet, just a simple jQuery interface on top of static HTML and CSS. Then I move to a backend language to the point of where I learn a web framework, how to use a database, how to query for data, how to respond to HTTP requests, things like that. And again, that's where I think JavaScript and Node are really going to hurt you. So I would try to learn my backend first in Ruby, and then integrate like my front end from jQuery, and then eventually learn React. But one thing at a time, because learning is hard enough.
I think that's a really good, thorough answer. So this one is for Amanda. Can you explain what the difference is between the in-person and the online class?
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I always start this question by saying what's not different between them. So they are very, very similar courses. In particular, the curriculum is exactly the same. You will cover the exact same concepts in the online and the in-person program. The big difference is how you learn. So in the in-person program, that is a 15-week full-time immersive program here on our campus in New York City. So you are doing nothing else other than studying with us for 15 weeks, learning all the stuff that Avi just described. It is instructor-led. You build a number of different projects. You work collaboratively with students in the class with you. The online program is an entirely self-paced program. So it is approximately 1,000 hours of work. Most students report it as in total about 800 to 1,000 hours of work. And you decide when to do those hours of work. We have many students in the online program who are doing it full-time, putting in 40-plus hours a week. We also have many students in the online program who do it part-time, who can't afford to quit their jobs, and so they study with us 20 to 25 hours a week, and they get through the program on that kind of time scale. The online program still has instructional support in many different ways. There's mentorship, there's instructional coaches who are almost always available to answer questions whenever you might have a question. So you will still get the great instructional support, you'll get the great curriculum. The big difference is the pace at which you learn and the sort of environment in which you do it. Do you want to be in an in-person, intensive environment, or do you want to be, or need to be, doing it in a self-paced way? And that's really the big difference between the two programs.
Yeah, and just to add a little to that, I think that what Amanda is saying is totally right, and it's really about flexibility. Online provides you with more flexibility. So, if you have a family you take care of, if you have to have a second job or a first job and you need to be working while you're doing it, if you can't move to a major city and take 3 to 4 months off of your life, the online program simply provides you with more flexibility. It's the same, community of passionate and inspired people from both students and instructors teaching you the exact same curriculum. We just really wanted to, we really care about the outcomes our school gets, and we knew that as long as we were running in-person boot camps, that just wasn't providing enough people with the opportunity to kind of get this kind of upward mobility in their career, because it's just, the in-person program is great, it's just not really flexible. You have to move to New York, you have to quit your job, it's hard to take care of a family, and online provides you so much more flexibility. But we're seeing almost exactly the same outcomes for our online graduates as we do for our in-person graduates.
Totally, yeah, thanks guys. This one, we'll put to Avi. We have some folks who work in UX. Are there any particular languages that they should be proficient in?
That's a great question. I mean, if you're actually an interface designer, you're more interested in crafting kind of quick prototypes, user interfaces, user experience, design kind of thing. Yeah, there I really think you need to focus on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and CSS preprocessor called Sass. You really want to stick to, you don't need to learn backend languages, especially not yet. And there I really think that you want to start with HTML, CSS, SAS, so that you can build really intricate designs and kind of understand front-end frameworks like Bootstrap, stuff like that, and then learn JavaScript. That way you can make it interactive. But if you want to be a user experience developer or front-end developer, then yeah, you don't need to learn a back-end language. And if you're more interested in the user experience and the interface and the design, there it's really HTML, CSS, SAS, and JavaScript.
Great. That is super helpful. So another question that we're getting is if somebody knows that they want to be a mobile developer, where should they start?
Yeah, mobile development is interesting. So there are two mobile platforms. There's Android and there's iOS. Android is basically a Java-type language written by Google. It's built on top of the JVM, or the Java Virtual Machine. Android is popular. And then there is iOS, which is basically a language called Swift, the iOS SDK, or a language called Objective-C. Those are the native mobile languages. We think that mobile is not necessarily the best place to get started for a few reasons. One, the job market just isn't as big. Two, even every mobile application is also a web application. And what I mean by that is, like, turn your phone on airplane mode and then tell me how awesome it is. So like when you use the Twitter mobile app, when you use the Snapchat mobile app, or the or Instagram, realize that that app is really just an interface, like a front end for all of this data that their back end of Instagram and Snapchat is providing. The back ends of the apps are always more intricate and larger than the front ends. So just mobile, like straight mobile development with no ability to understand HTTP, the web, a back-end language, databases, straight mobile development is a very niche job market. So I don't know if you should really approach your career as, I want to start as a mobile developer. You want to start as a generic developer, which is a web developer, and then move into being an amazing mobile developer. You can build mobile interfaces with things like React Native. So we are seeing a movement in mobile that, kind of away from the native mobile language of like Swift, Objective-C, Android, into like using like JavaScript and JavaScript type frameworks to compile down to those. But if you really just off the bat wanted to be a straight mobile developer, I would tell you to learn Android or learn Swift entirely.
Amanda, can you talk a little bit more about the scholarships that we offer, both for the in-person and online courses?
Sure. So as you see on your screen right now, we're currently offering a Commit to Code scholarship. We try to be pretty generous with our scholarshiping, especially for the online program. We're usually running 2 or 3 different ones at the same time. So right now, this Commit to Code scholarship is a pretty classic example of a scholarship we might offer for the online program. What a scholarship is going to try to do is it's going to try to reduce the sort of since it's a monthly subscription, almost like a Netflix subscription. We're going to try to bring that amount down for people to make it more in line with what they can pay. So you can apply as someone who's interested in the Commit to Code scholarship, and then through the application process, you'll speak to one of our admissions advisors, and they'll be able to let you know what other scholarships we have going on that you might be applicable for. So for instance, for most of this year, we've been running some version of the Women Take Tech Scholarship, which you might have seen on the website. You can definitely go check that out. If you are eligible for that, your admissions officer will let you know at the interview process, and then they'll be able to tell you exactly what that would do for the cost of the program and for you specifically. If that's still not sufficient, we also have a scholarship application that you can fill out once you're admitted to the program, which will take into account your particular financial circumstances and the strength of your application, the impression of the admissions advisor, and all of that stuff. So the short answer is, for any scholarship, the first step is going to be to apply, and then once you apply, you'll be speaking to one of our admissions advisors who can tell you more about either the Commit to Code scholarship or any other scholarship we may have running when your application is sort of in consideration. That is also true for the in-person program. So if you're interested in our in-person program and are seeking a scholarship, all scholarship decisions are made upon admission, and again, there would be an application for you to fill out once you're admitted to be considered for those kinds of scholarship dollars. Scholarships to the in-person program are partial scholarships. They're not full scholarships, but we do try to give out a pretty decent amount per class to make sure that the greatest the greatest diversity of students can have that course be financially viable. So don't let sort of finances or fear of not getting a scholarship stop you from applying. The first step in all of it is to apply and speak to someone on our admissions team, and from there we'll be able to identify what scholarships you personally might be applicable to you, and we'll take it from there.
Cool. Throwing it back to Avi, I'm getting a lot of different questions about, you know, if there are so many languages and languages that are sort of in vogue or changing all the time, how do you stay in the learning mindset, and how do you keep up with what's on the horizon and what will be the next valuable thing to learn?
That's a great question. You know, there's a lot in programming, and I think that's kind of like the double-edged sword of it. Like on one level, programming is always changing. There's always new things to learn, and that's so exciting. And on another level, programming is always changing. There's always new things to learn, and I'm just so tired. So like, you know, it's both what makes the career interesting and also very difficult. I think that, again, the best thing to start realizing is that the languages don't matter. In the sense that, like, the metaphor I always use is like poetry. That I think programming is more like poetry than we realize. And poetry is not about English or Spanish or French or German. You can write poetry in all those languages, because poetry is really about like imagery and rhythm and rhyme and meter and simile and metaphor and things like that. And those are abstract things that you can express in any language. Programming to me is really about like encapsulation and logic and abstraction, about, you know, kind of managing state and responding to events. And those are things that you do in every language. So the more that you start, when you learn, that you know, kind of like don't lose the forest for the trees. So like Ruby is one programming language, but as you're learning Ruby, think about like, well, what are the universals in here? Because then as you see new technologies, they become less intimidating. Like everything that's foreign about them suddenly becomes familiar, and it's easier to learn them. So like at this point, like I'm not super intimidated by new languages, and I almost can kind of read a new language's code and understand how it's working, because I know that ultimately in whatever language I'm currently reading, it's trying to do the same things that this other language I know is. And when I'm looking for the comparisons, oh well, you know, in Elixir we make an object like this, and in Ruby we make an object like that. But I'm still thinking about how do I instantiate objects, because I know that no matter what I'm programming in, I'm going to have to do that kind of thing. So again, like I think that's why learning two languages at first is a really great way to get started, because immediately you're going to develop that meta skill of learning how to learn faster, and thinking about, you know, what are the similarities here, what's different, what are the abstractions, what are you looking for when you're learning something new. And that kind of reduces the entropy or the kind of difficulty of learning new things. And then, you know, you just kind of have to eventually at some point in your career start saying, I don't care what everyone else is doing. Like, I know enough about my job, and I know the tools I'm really comfortable with, and like, yeah, just because all these, you know, newfangled kids are running on my lawn with a bunch of React, like, I don't care. I'm still going to program the way I know how to program, because I can ultimately, here are two people that don't care about what you use to build something. Your users and your boss. All we care about is that you've created value and meaning for people through software. The details of how we did that are the craft that we care about, that we appreciate. But that's not, like, the users don't care if you used React or jQuery. When you're using Facebook, do you care that, like, its backend is built in Ruby or Python or PHP? No, you care that, you know, you're able to see what your mom did that weekend. Maybe, I don't know. Right? So, like, you know, again, that's where I kind of think that programmers get a little lost. We start obsessing over the tooling and the craft as though the part of that the reason why we're programmers is for programming. No, the reason why we're programmers are to, like, improve people's existence in the world through software. And how you do that is a means to an end. So don't get too lost in it. At some point, you know, I just shut out. Like, I don't read Hacker News anymore. I don't care what new JavaScript framework is coming out. Like, I know that, you know, when it gets to a tipping point, I'll start paying attention to it. I get excited about certain things, but for the most part, you know, I know where I'm at, and I'm pretty comfortable there, and I can build the kinds of things that matter to me and to the people whose lives I'm trying to impact.
Awesome. That's a really great answer for that question. I think a lot of people struggle with that. Amanda, back to you. We have a question from someone who is sort sort of looking to get over the hump from just tinkering with code to being able to build something and think that they should have built something before they apply to a coding bootcamp. Can you explain when is the right time to apply?
Sure, absolutely. So I sort of like the impetus there of like I want to show that I can do this. I want to show that I know what I'm doing, and I think that's awesome. I think you can do that at a smaller scale than having built a whole thing. Like if you want to build a whole thing and send us your like tic-tac-toe game or your text-based adventure game, which I have had students do, and it's kind of amazing. By all means, go nuts. But not everybody has that kind of time. Not everybody can get that kind of thing working on the time scale that they want to start studying. What that really is that's a proxy for passion, right? Like what we're ultimately looking for is we're looking for people who are excited about the actual act of writing code, right? Like not excited about the cool new startup they're going to start in 2 years or whatever, but like the actual, like sitting down at a computer, at a terminal, writing lines of code. And you can do that by building us a project, or you can do that by like getting super deep into our bootcamp prep course, or even one of our intro courses, Intro to Ruby, Intro to JavaScript, right? Because in order to do that, in order to make progress there, you've got to have something inside you that is satisfied by the actual act of writing code. Like you keep coming back to it, you keep solving lessons. If we see that you're doing that, that tells us you're excited about the actual act of sitting down and writing code and solving those kinds of problems and clearing error messages and getting tests to pass. Like that needs to be the thing that you love and find exciting. So if you want to build something, go nuts. We love seeing like sometimes people write like little websites and stuff for us, and it's super fun. But don't feel like you need to go to that kind of an extreme. For Flatiron's admissions purposes, getting started on one of our free tracks and finishing a handful to a dozen or so lessons will tell you whether or not you're passionate, whether or not you're excited about learning the way that we teach and how our curriculum works, and should be sufficient to show the admissions team the same thing, to show your passion and show your commitment.
Awesome. So if someone has applied to Flatiron School and was rejected, is there a period of time they should wait before they reapply? Should they reapply?
Sure, so you can absolutely reapply. We recommend, just because it's what we've seen students do to be most successful, that you take a little bit of time in between applications. And when I say that, I mean, don't just like set a clock and reapply in a month, but, take the time that you need to build some additional skill. Basically what you want to do if you're reapplying is apply with a different application than you applied the first time, right? You don't want to apply with a carbon copy of your application and a carbon copy of the same skill set that you had the first time around. Go out and, if you've been learning JavaScript, maybe learn a little Ruby just to show us you've done something different. If you just got to a couple of lessons in the bootcamp prep track the first time you applied, go a little farther, see if that helps you learn and strengthens your application. But you want that second application to be what I call like sort of materially different from the first one. Like show us something has changed, show us what has grown, and that is the thing that will get your attention and give you a better shot on your second time around. But absolutely reapply. We certainly have students who are not successful the first time around for whatever reason and have come back and shown us how they've grown and shown us how they've learned and how their passion and excitement has increased and have been successful the second time around.
Awesome. Throwing it back to Avi, for those of our attendees and those who will watch the recording afterwards, if they have not written a single line of code, they are totally coming at this as beginners, what's the first place they should start?
Yeah, I think if you've really never written a single line of code and you've no idea what a terminal is, I think that Code Academy is just the best place to get your feet wet. It's just so easy to get started writing code. I think their Intro to Ruby and their Intro to the Command Line are the best places to get started on Code Academy. I don't think it's worth doing everything on Code Academy because at some point that kind of contrived REPL experience where you're programming these little text boxes in the browser, it's not really doing you a service anymore. But in the beginning, especially their Intro to Command Line, that's going to teach you about what really your operating system is and how to like navigate your files and things like that. I think the Intro to Command Line is great. And then I think Intro to Ruby is great because you're going to learn some really simple concepts like variables and methods and arguments and scope that exist in every single language. And then I think learn.co is a great place to go and actually start understanding design patterns and progressions and really using a real environment. So if you've never in a line of code, I think, spend a week or two on Code Academy on their Intro to Ruby, Intro to Command Line, Intro to JavaScript, and then I think move to our bootcamp prep and do all of that. By the end of bootcamp prep, you're going to be a pretty good programmer.
Awesome. That actually answers one of our other questions, which is, if you finish bootcamp prep, will you be successful in the course? I think it's a really good start.
Yeah, I mean, the bootcamp prep course is like 100 hours. That's a pretty sizable amount of code. You'll get into basically every bootcamp, I think, and I think you're going to be very well prepared once you're in that bootcamp.
Awesome. So I'll throw this one to both of you, actually. We get questions pretty much every time we do a webinar, asking for advice for those of our community who are a little bit older. Amanda, maybe you could talk about some of our older students who have been accepted and gone through the program and found success. Maybe Avi, we could talk about the industry a little bit, bigger picture, and how maybe those who are doing a bigger career change fit in there.
Sure. Do you want to start me off?
Sure. I mean, I guess the first thing is that I think it's very easy to think of all the reasons why you're not going to be successful when you start this kind of career path. I hear that same question from like 23-year-olds. They're like, I'm 23, no one's going to take me seriously. I hear that. I mean, again, we all have our own insecurities. It's so easy for us to think about all the reasons why we're not going to be successful. So, your age, your gender, your race, your experience level, just, ignore it. I've seen every kind of person from, every demographic succeed in this, and it's really about their ability to stay positive and to stay focused. And the second you start allowing your mind to tell you all these reasons why you're not going to succeed, you're sitting down to code for the day, and instead of reminding yourself what you worked on yesterday, what you're going to be spending 20 minutes thinking about is why you suck. And that's not helpful. Again, I don't think that there's anything about someone's age that makes them a better or worse programmer. I'll tell you from a career perspective, people with work experience that have had jobs, that have managed people, that work on teams, that have a resume, that can communicate, that understand being goal-oriented. Yeah, sure, they're new programmers, but that's a lot of really valuable experience, because programming is not like me sitting alone in my headphones, in a dark room banging out code. I'm going to meetings, I have a team, I'm reporting to people, I'm pairing with them, I'm communicating with them, I'm speccing things out, I'm correlating the code I wrote to business goals. There's so much more to being a successful professional developer than your technical proficiency. And the older you are, the more likely that your experience in your career is going to give people confidence that those are the things you're going to do really well. So we're seeing a lot of our older students start as developers, but quickly move into managerial roles. Because if you can code and you've worked on a developer team, but then you also have people skills and managerial skills, that company's going to really value that. And they're going to value that a lot more than code, because it's hard to find great engineering managers. And engineers need to be managed. So I think that there's a lot of ways to be successful in your career in tech. Being a developer is only one of them. If you want to write code for the rest of your life and you're starting at 40, I definitely have seen students do that. So I just don't think you should let that really factor into your psyche as you start this journey. It's going to end up being this excuse you tell yourself all the time. And we are our own worst enemies. So I would try to say to stay away from that line of thinking. We've seen every demographic succeed, so I don't see why you'd be different.
Yeah, and just to add to that, as someone who reads applications all day, every day, I've seen examples of what he's talking about. Everybody has their reason for why they're afraid they won't be good at this or won't be successful. I talked to people who were journalism majors who talked themselves out of coding for years because they thought it wasn't for them. And by the time they come to me and by the time they're in our admissions process, the only thing they ever say is, I wish I had started earlier. I wish I hadn't sort of been so afraid to start, because now that I'm doing it, I love it, and this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And if that's true for you, regardless of where you're coming from and whether you're concerned about age or background or gender or anything like that, the best time to start is today, because if you don't start today, it's one less day that you're going to have to get good at it and to start that career that you really love. There's certainly examples of students in our classes right now who are coming at this from 15 or 20-year careers who have since decided that no, now is the time for me to become a developer. If you come by, if you're in New York and you can swing by campus, or if you ever talk to any of our alums, you'll see there's a wide variety of backgrounds, wide variety of ages and experiences that's in our course, and that's ultimately what employers are going to be interested in, is not how old you were when you started, but what you can do now and how excited you are to build stuff for them in the future.
Awesome. So one last question. There are a ton of coding boot camps out there. What sets us apart? What makes us different? I think you can both certainly speak to this for hours and hours.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Do you want to start us off?
Well, I mean, I'd say for one, we've been around for like 5 years. All the other ones have started in the last like 6 months. So we have a pretty good track record. You can trust us. We've been doing this. We really care about it. Like, we didn't think like, oh, this is a cool industry and we want to get in and make some money. And, like, we really, Adam and I and everyone who works here, were really interested in exploring the ways in which education could change people's lives and kind of the ineffectiveness of what traditional education is. And we've been putting a lot of effort and a lot of thought into, maintaining our quality. We've grown so slowly compared to our competitors because our students' lives are everything to us. We understand the sacrifices they make to attend our school, and like, man, we celebrate every time a student gets a job. Like, it is magic to us. And everyone here comes in every day just looking to really be a part of people's lives in a positive way. And I just don't know if the other schools are honest about that. It's easy for all of us to say that, but again, if you speak to our alumni, if you experience, learn, and see the thoughtfulness we've put into the platform and the amount we've invested in curriculum and technology to make learning effective and accessible to people, to see where our alumni go from writing books to speaking at conferences, becoming core contributors, to working at amazing companies, I think that's like really what sets us apart. We really love this. Like, we really love teaching people not just a skill set that is employable, but a way to see more in themselves and the world around them, of contributing through a new medium. And that's what really code and technology is to us. And I think that, I never went to any of the other boot camps, so I don't know what it's like there. But I know that, we think a lot about how to make this as accessible and effective to people as possible, how to really give them a passion and a love and a career that really addresses their whole person. Yeah, we take our jobs really, really seriously. Our faculty are not a bunch of contractors or like, oh, I'm a practitioner and a teacher. I don't think developers make great teachers. I think great teachers who know how to code make great teachers. So, I know a lot of schools that use contractors, use, people that are coming in for 1 hour a day from their programming job as instructors, and we take pride in our faculty and teacher training and a real sensitivity to how people learn and to what makes it effective. We're not trying to shove you in front of like a 6-hour lecture video that you watch alone and then do a lab. Like, there are lectures and it's fun and it's engaging and there are study groups. We want it to be social. We want it to be a part of your life. We want you to be a different person by the time you end our program, and everything we've done in terms of this experience is really towards that goal, to deliver like a really transformative educational experience. And I just don't know if other boot camps even use that word or think about that. They're just like, how do we get people jobs? How do we get people to learn how to code? And that is a great bar. That is a low bar that I hope all of them are getting, but I don't believe that's necessarily true. We want to change your life. Like, teaching you how to code is just a mechanism of really changing who you are and how you fit into this world.
Yeah, and ultimately, the only thing I can add to that is, in my experience talking to students who are like, why should I choose you over a different school, or what should bring me to Flatiron School? I throw it back to the student and I say, well, what are you attempting to do in all of this, right? Like, are you people don't invest in a boot camp, whether us or anybody else, like, for fun or trivially, right? Like, they're looking to get an outcome and they're looking to change their lives, right? They're looking to change their careers. If you're thinking about doing this, you're probably looking to change your career. The thing I would be asking myself as a student is, what is the school that's most likely to help me do that, given everything I know, given everything I'm looking for in a student community, given everything I'm looking for in terms of student outcomes, both in terms of immediate first-time placement, but also in terms of generating career outcomes for students. Those are the things that I would be looking at. And on all of those measures, obviously, since I work here, I believe that we are the school that is uniquely positioned to help you do that.
Great. Well, thank you guys all for joining us. Really appreciate it. And as always, let us know if you have any questions. Admissions@flatironschool.com, Avi@flatironschool.com, at Avi Flombaum, or at Avi at Flatiron School on Twitter. Thank you, Emily and Amanda, for joining me today.
Yeah.
And have a great week, everyone.
Bye.